Hello, welcome to Books and Brews,
the place where beer and literature meet.
With your host, certified Cicerone Michael Agnew.
And Laura Mosica, author of the Bluebells Chronicles.
Each month we invite a guest author to read their words and talk about writing while sipping beers specially paired with their work.
Today's guest is poet Tim Young.
So sit back,
pop a cold one,
and dive into some books
and brews. Sound check is done. We're good to go. What's back to? First of all, hi, Laura.
Yeah. Oh, Michael, why, I didn't notice you sitting there. I've been up to taking lots of phone calls. I had my second grandson this month.
Wow,
or I
congratulations.
Should say, yeah, more appropriately, my daughter-in-law had my second grandson this month. I sat at home and did nothing. So yeah, very exciting. And much more exciting, he was born on my son's 20th birthday. So wow. that was kind of exciting for my son to have a birthday buddy now. Mm-hmm. And I've been busy with Gabriel Sworn. We released Dream of Dragons. That just came out a few days ago. And we are working on a multi-author giveaway. So people should check in on my sites for that. And I have chainmail on the way. Ooh. And I discovered on Facebook, those of us who grew up in the 70s still think that means the letter is saying, pass this on to 10 people or death and woe will befall you. I had to clarify, no, that's like what knights wear. So how's your month?
Speaking of chainmail, old school chainmail, I once had this thing come to me. It was really cool, actually. So it was art chainmail.
Really?
So you were sent a piece of art, mm-hmm. and then you were supposed to send a piece of your art to 10 people, mm-hmm. And those people would send you back one or whatever.
So however what kind of art, like how old were you? Things you colored and sent to them?
No, this was as an adult. As an adult. So this was, I got, I didn't get much because people didn't do it, but I got a CD from a flute ensemble in Germany.
Oh, neat.
I got some drawings, mm-hmm. Stuff like that. And I sent out, at the time I was doing stuff at a little community radio station in St. mm-hmm. Louis, doing little skits, and I mm-hmm. sent out cassette tapes of those.
Okay, so this was all kinds of art, not just
all kinds of art, yeah.
Speaking of which, we have Renoir coming up in our program.
I know. That was the hard one to pair to as well. So, I knew what I wanted, but it's not easy to find.
And I hope your month's better than last month.
I had them dig a 20-foot deep hole in the street and fix my sewer drain.
Okay.
So we don't flood the basement anymore.
Okay.
Been practicing hard on my banjo.
And how's that coming along?
It's coming along really well. So the book that I got to learn mm-hmm. comes with a CD.
Okay.
That gives you accompaniment mm-hmm. to the songs you're learning.
Okay, cool.
So you play the song with other musicians.
What songs are you playing?
I'm only playing one song so far. I've only learned one.
Well, that's kind of
boil them cabbage down. It's really simple. But here's the thing that I discovered. When I play by myself, mm-hmm. I can play it over and over and over again perfectly mm-hmm. with no mistakes, and I can play it fast. Mm-hmm. I get with the other musicians, and it's like,
and then you say, like my students, they're messing me up.
And I figured out part of it is, so it comes in, you can play this in 2 speeds, 50 beats a minute or mm-hmm. 60 beats a minute. Okay. And I was doing it on the 50 beats, mm-hmm. and their tempo is just relentlessly accurate.
Well, that is as it should be.
And mine is not. So that's part of what was messing me up. And I kept wanting to race. I kept wanting to speed up. Uh-huh. So I tried it last night on 60 beats a minute. Uh-huh. Much easier. Because they were playing it at the speed that I wanted to play it.
Yeah. Well, so that worked out well. And what have you read this month?
Nothing.
So I have to cover for you again.
Yep.
I only tried to cover for you. I still have not gotten Oscar Shaheen's book back from my son that I was trying to read last week. So, I've been thinking about it. So I think that counts for something. And then I'm kind of on a medieval mystics kick. So I'm reading Julian of Norwich's Revelations of Divine Love, written in the 1300s. one of the first books ever published, by the way,
wow.
when the Gutenberg Press came out. So,
I've read some of those medieval mystics. I was kind of into that in high school.
Books.
They're really fascinating.
Yeah. Julian of Norwich is a fascinating character, too. So, anyway.
Who's our guest?
Our guest today is Tim Young.
Hello.
So, welcome, Tim. We actually have two poets this month and next month leading up to National Poetry Month. And so Timothy Young, you go by Tim, right?
Tim.
Okay, I think
fine.
I took this off your site somewhere. Timothy Young has published 4 books and 3 chapbooks of poetry. He has recorded 4 CDs of poetry with various musicians, produced poetry on cultural videos, organized readings, cultural events, festivals, and concerts, and for 5 years co-hosted the Northland Library Literary Review on KFAI Radio. His work has been chosen for the Writer's Almanac, the Best American Poetry of 1999, college textbooks, many magazines, and has been the inspiration for award-winning musical compositions performed in Jazz at Lincoln Center is the title of the program. The University of Texas, Arlington, St. Olaf College, and many other venues. He has been, I noticed poet is not on the list here. I found this very interesting.
That's right.
In addition to being a poet, he has been a cattle inspector, something you don't think of as going with poetry, a police and fire dispatcher in Alaska, a handyman at an indigenous people's clinic in Mexico, an inner-city newspaper editor, an organizer for Robert Bly's men's conferences, and has taught storytelling, anger management, and moral judgment to at-risk youth at the Red Wing Correctional Facility. And just as a side note, you might be interested, his anthropological son teaches brewing and its history and is the assistant brewer at Flying Bike Cooperative Brewery in Seattle.
Wow, nice.
That's right.
So, a lot of
You got to direct him to the podcast.
I will, absolutely.
Yeah, so what is our first beer?
First beer. So this marks a landmark, a turning point, if you will, in the books and brews here, in that this is the first time I'm serving a flawed beer.
A flawed beer?
Yes, a beer that does not taste like it's supposed to taste.
I take it this is not a paid endorsement.
So, Green Bottle Heineken has a distinctive flavor that everybody expects from Green Bottle Heineken, but it isn't a flavor that should be there in beer. So something happens with beer in that light, particularly full spectrum sunlight or fluorescent light, interacts with the bittering acids in hops and converts them chemically to a chemical that is very analogous to the spray of a skunk. So the technical term for it is light struck. Typically we call it skunked. So Green Bottle Heineken is always skunked because green glass does not block the wavelengths of light that do that. Now, of course, the brewers at Heineken know this. They're not dumb. They're very highly trained brewers. And in, the Netherlands, Heineken comes in a brown bottle.
Okay.
Here it's in green because early on we all associated green bottles with it, high quality imports. And so that kind of stuck. Heineken, you think green bottle. So we get Green Bottle Heineken that is skunked, always.
And apparently people do like it, or they wouldn't keep selling it.
Yes. So smell is first. It should be pretty well skunked.
Okay, if only we were doing a video, you could see the look on my face. Yeah. It's a strong smell.
It's a strong smell. Just like a skunk. Pretty much exactly like a skunk.
Exactly, yep.
I did a private tasting once for a group, and for some reason, I don't know why, they wanted me to do off flavors. Who knows? And before I started, they were pre-gaming my tasting flight with their own beers, and they were drinking Stella, which also comes in a green bottle. And one of the off flavors that I brought was Light Struck. So I'm mixing that up in my Amstel Light, and I give it to them. And the first thing somebody said was, "This tastes just like Stella." Yes, it does.
Well done.
And it shouldn't.
Well, so cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers to skunked beer. You want to go ahead and read us the first poem here, and you'll know why.
Absolutely.
Skunked beer.
And I anticipated this.
You obviously know a little bit.
Yes.
I couldn't guess what he was going to do.
I was wondering if this was going to be your choice. So this is a poem about my Gramps when I was a young boy. Gramps and the Skunk. Once upon a time, when life was in balance, Gramps saw a skunk at the door. With his trusty .22, he shot the critter with a single bullet to the head. But when Gramps approached to give it a burial, the white stripe lifted and quickly shot back with an accurate squirt to his face. Because he wore glasses, he didn't go blind, but dunked his head in tomato juice over and over, yet the odor lingered, and the children and Grandma stayed away. So he took to his rowboat with his tackle, oars, and beer, circling the lake and quietly trolling in that perfect palace of stars.
Very nice. So just a poll here. How many of you have been sprayed by a skunk?
I have not been, but I have. Our
Okay.
pet dog when I was a kid got sprayed by a skunk.
I have never been. I don't think my dog has ever been.
I've had both experiences.
Well, I love the image of him dunking his head in the tomato juice.
You know, there are people, I know people who love that smell.
I had a friend who did. You know, I actually cannot smell the smell of skunks. So it's funny when we've been out driving, you know, in decades past, and everybody in the car is like, they're just dying, and well, must be a skunk. But I do have a friend who likes the smell. So obviously it's based on a true story. One of my first questions is, what is the draw we have as the human race to tell the stories of our ancestors?
Well, in the first place, I believe that they're deep inside of us, both in our bones and our memories. And of course, for instance, this poem, the sense of smell bypasses many neurons in the brain and takes us to places in the memory faster.
It's in the smell receptors are in the same part of your brain.
Was this an incident that you witnessed personally?
Yes, it was.
Oh, you know what? I don't think I realized that when I read the poem. I didn't know if it was a story that your father had handed down to you.
No, I was there.
Okay, so did he come running? Did he just sort of saunter in?
No, my grandfather didn't run anywhere. He was a very patient man, and actually he had been gassed in France twice.
So skunk was nothing.
Yeah, I mean, and I think he was sprayed more than once in his life. So he started yelling from outside of the cabin, and we had to bring tomato juice for him to dunk his head, and we poured it over his head, and washed him.
So what was your grandmother, you?
And my brothers and sisters, we were all at the cabin, at the lake cabin up northern Minnesota.
So how many brothers and sisters?
I'm the oldest of 11.
Oh, so this was quite a crowd.
Oh, yeah.
And did they keep the tomato juice on hand?
We always had tomato juice because we always had an issue with skunks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So they knew.
And so we knew my grandfather was trapping skunks. You know, it was just an issue at that time. And so we watched him. We watched him shoot the skunk, get sprayed. We had to clean him.
The image is getting better and better. You know, 11 kids and Grandma all pouring out of the cabin, all pouring.
No, we stayed in the cabin.
Oh, okay. So
watched him from the windows.
Toss the tomato juice out to her.
I was the oldest, and I was carrying tomato juice out there.
So, do you have a lot of poems about him, about your family?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
I
Are they collected anywhere?
Here and there, yes.
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, I think that would make a great book.
Well, I actually brought you each a copy of my latest book, and this poem is in that book with some others.
So, do you have a particular favorite subject matter for poetry?
No.
Okay, so you're sort of all over the place.
You read my biography, more or less. Yep. That's also the way my poetry goes.
Okay, all over.
Yeah, I consider myself a journalist of the soul.
Mm-hmm. I like that term.
Whatever the soul needs to have reported, that's what the poet does.
So what got you started in poetry?
Oh, what started me? My goodness. Late night walks when I was a teenager, getting out of the house. Mm-hmm. Because I was the oldest, I needed to escape as a teenager.
So that makes me curious. Did you grow up in a relatively small house? I'm asking because I'm thinking of my mother. She was the oldest of 9, and they grew up in, I don't know, a 1,200 square foot house with 3 bedrooms.
Yeah, and they never felt that. We had 4 bedrooms and a walkout basement where my grandparents lived. Okay. So there were 13 of us in the house. Mm-hmm. But even still, when you have 11 children, there are 4 of us in 1 bedroom.
Right.
Yeah.
But we had a huge yard, a huge park behind us, so, once we were out of the house, we had plenty of space.
Right.
And we had property on a lake.
And I think in those days, kids were more likely to go out of the house, too.
Exactly.
The world has changed so much. Now, I was really fascinated. You've had all these jobs in the past that have nothing to do with poetry, and yet you ended up working with Robert Bly, and your poetry is in college textbooks. How did this happen?
Well, when I came back from working in Mexico and Alaska, I decided I need to find work that paid me something.
And you chose poetry?
No, I chose journalism.
You said one day I'll be on Books and Brews and I'll get a free beer out of this.
No, I actually did my master's work in journalism.
Okay.
And at the same time, I was working with a lot of poets and street poets. And I met a number of journalists and more or less decided, no, I'm going to stay with the job that I have and focus on poetry. Mm-hmm. I was working a night shift where I could read, where I could write. Mm-hmm. And I decided to stay with that work instead of traveling around because I had traveled. And I met too many journalists who had become too cynical, and I didn't want to follow that path.
Mm-hmm. So are you saying that poetry helped you not become cynical?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And I can see why, looking at your poetry, and this is one of the things that I kind of brought up in Donna's interview, is that when I've been to a lot of the poetry events, there are a lot of people doing, let's change the world and we're angry, and it's such a breath of fresh air to read Donna's poetry and yours. It's full of these beautiful images and happiness. And
except I've also done that. I've also tried to change the world. I was arrested many times, protesting. I was a street poet, a radical poet, when I was doing the radio show, But again, as with my life and my poetry, it's not limited to one theme, to one. Human beings are not one.
And that's true. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to do some of the poems that look at, frustrations, anger. My problem is when it seems that's the whole body of work coming from everybody sometimes. And so I really enjoyed reading yours with Ann Donna's and quite a few others too, Biere's. We've had a lot of people on who have really had poetry I like a lot. So how did you end up getting your work into college textbooks? Was that a fluke?
No.
Just in the right place at the right time?
In the 80s and 90s, I was submitting to as many magazines as possible.
And so are the college textbooks picking up from there?
Well, actually, the college textbooks picked them up from the Best Of series.
Okay.
So I was in the Best American Poet 99.
Okay.
And depending upon who is who, who's reading what. You know, that's how it ended up.
Okay.
Purely by accident.
But the path started with submitting to lots of magazines.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
How many hours a week would you say that you put into poetry?
Well,
in those years.
In those years, oh boy, that's hard to say because you know, I was a stay-at-home dad during the day, working evenings, and so when I was able to work on the job, when I could fit that in, so it was, you know, I tried to work at least a couple hours every day.
Okay.
And
so that's a lot of dedication.
Oh, and for the last 5-6 years, it's anywhere from 4 to 5 hours per day.
So
least.
You've really stepped it up.
And I've kept
relaxed.
at it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's always what makes things happen. I discussed that with my piano students.
Yes.
All the talent in the world doesn't get you anywhere if you don't work. So you have worked with Robert Bly. Explain to our 4.8 million listeners, what is the big deal about Robert Bly? Who was he? And in fact, I should say, who is he? He's still alive.
He's still alive. Robert's still alive.
What,
93. 93.
Okay.
Yeah. Robert Bly is...
is he still active?
Not as a poet, no.
Okay.
No. Robert is one of the... it's Haki Madhubuti, the great African-American poet, said Robert is one of the best, the 25 best writers of the 20th century. Robert took poetry into an entirely different direction. He was accused of being a regional poet, but actually he was a poet of the deep soul. That's how I like to describe it. Robert has probably influenced more poets that I know of in more poetry in the last half of the 20th century than any other poet, American poet. He's translated Rumi, he's translated Neruda, Lorca, so many poets from Spain and South America and Latin America. You know, in the 90s, Rumi was the #1 published poet in America, and Robert Bly started translating Rumi in the 60s and encouraged Coleman Barks to start working on Rumi's poems. And Coleman Barks is considered, the driving force for that, the poetry of Rumi and Sufi poetry. And
which I find it interesting. Robert Bly is from what, northwestern Minnesota?
No, southwestern Minnesota. Yeah, okay. Down on the farmland in southwestern.
Fairly small town, right?
Oh yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, there is nothing else in southwest Minnesota.
No, it's farms. There's small towns in Madison, Minnesota,
and yet he became this world force.
Yeah, he went to. He went to Northfield, St. Olaf for a year, then went to Harvard. And while he was at Harvard, that's where so many of the great poets of the second half of the century, Donald Hall, Galway Connell, Adrian Rich, Denise Levitroff, many of them were there at Harvard around that same time. And it was a driving force, and it changed the direction of poetry.
I think we are ready to go to beer number 2, and I'm going to save my next question for
All right.
this section.
So this next collection of poems based on Renoir's paintings was the hardest one to pair, and not because I didn't know what I wanted, but because you can't find what I wanted. It's a reflection of where the beer market is now, so heavily focused on local and heavily focused on IPA that a lot of the imports that used to be here are no longer here. So this style, Biere de Garde, is, France is not known for beer. It's known for wine. But in northern France, along the Belgian border, there is beer, because that's getting up into beer territory up there. So, Biere de Garde is like the best known French style of beer. Started out, like last month we had a Saison, which was a farmhouse beer. Biere de Garde started out as that, brewed, to keep people hydrated through the summer when you couldn't make beer. And it evolved in the 1950s, I guess, into sort of an established style. If you were going to drink beer in a cafe, if you were going to drink authentic French beer in a cafe, you would be drinking Biere de Garde, although you probably won't find a Biere de Garde in a French cafe. But let's say back in the 1800s you would.
Where did you finally find it?
So this is from Finnegans Brewing in Minneapolis, so it is local. Yeah. It's the only Biere de Garde that I found. This is aged in oak barrels. So not bourbon barrels or anything, just oak barrels, and you definitely taste the oak on there. Malty, a little bit spicy from fermentation, a little bit barnyard, and definite oak. You like this one?
Not as much as some of the other darker ones.
Okay.
That you picked. But as I say, you're slowly turning me into a beer drinker of some sort.
I will buy that.
Probably still won't go out and buy any this week, but 2-3 years down the road I might. So our reading, 1998 calendar of Pierre-August Renoir's paintings. August, by the way, is my new grandson's name.
Oh.
So you chose well. Go ahead.
October. Madame Claude Monet's reading. The mother-to-be who reads gives her unborn quietness and brocade pillows on which to play inside her, in the living room of the now, the bowl of the future. November, self-portrait. To be present, a smile is not required. But if you smile, do so because your heart changes and its excitement is too large to stay behind your lips. December, at the concert. There is always a woman on New Year's Eve, standing at the edge of a garden, watching you, calling to you, and inviting you to fall in love with your life.
Very nice. Can you, for our 4.9 million listeners, can you describe each of these three paintings? Just a brief description. We'll probably put some pictures up.
Yeah, briefly, it's a painting of Madame Claudette, Madame Renoir reading, or it's Madame Monet.
Madame Monet, yeah.
Reading, and it's pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and she's in sort of a blue, is it blue and gold sort of gown?
I don't remember.
I looked it up last night.
Oh, good for you.
I thought I should have some clue what I'm talking about.
It's been a few years since I looked at the pictures. Actually, I no longer have this calendar. Okay. Yeah, I gave, for a number of years, I would get a calendar and write a short poem and then give the calendar as a Christmas present. So.
Did you give it with the poems?
Yeah, the poems were pasted onto the paint, onto the month.
That's a neat idea.
Yeah. Self-portrait, of course, there's the picture of Renoir himself, and I just remember at the concert it was a bit different. It was not a close-up. It was a room full of people and in a garden, and this woman was off to the side.
Did he by any chance have two paintings called At the Concert?
I don't. I have no idea.
Okay,
yeah.
I think so, because when I was looking for the paintings, there were two at the concert.
Okay.
Yeah. One was like in a box.
Yeah.
Right. One they were inside.
No, that's not the one.
Yeah, I figured it wasn't, but I was curious about that because I didn't find the one in the garden. I found a painting that looked like his style in the garden, but it was labeled something else on my search.
Yeah.
So maybe it had two names. So you had a calendar every month, so 12 paintings by Renoir?
Yeah, for this calendar, I would purchase the calendar in the late fall, and then I would scribble these short little poems, put each one
so you do have a full set of Renoir poems.
Oh, yes.
By full set, I mean 12.
I have 12 years of 12 poems based on calendars.
Okay, but not all in Renoir.
No, not all. Some were different Impressionists. Some were American Impressionists. Some were photographs.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask what drew you to Renoir in particular, but it seems, I mean, do you have a particular love for him? Or
no,
that's, okay.
No. I was attracted to the calendar, and that began this process. Yeah.
And what made you decide to do that? I mean,
I don't, for me, it was a response to the calendars. It was a response. I've always responded, like I said earlier, I responded to the imagery of Gramps and the skunk. Right now, I'm currently, my wife is an artist and a violinist, and I have written many poems based either upon her compositions or on her art, and a number of them are in my books. I'm responding. These are responses to whatever's in front of me. Sometimes it's art, sometimes it's animals. Yeah.
And does it sort of come up naturally, or are there times when you say, I am going to write today, so let's look for an inspiration?
It depends. It changes. 2 years ago, I decided to write poetry based on the paintings of Andrew Wyeth and Helga, specifically Helga paintings. And I went through his entire art book.
So tell us who he
Andrew
is
Wyeth.
And what are the Helga paintings?
Andrew Wyeth is a realist type painter, an American painter. In the 1980s, my first wife was also an artist, and she was enthralled with Andrew Wyeth's paintings. And Andrew Wyeth released a book. It was filled with paintings of Helga, who was both his neighbor and his model, and he had secretly been painting her for 15 years. His wife did not know that.
Did Helga know it?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, she was nude in most of them. Yeah.
Okay. So it was not a secret from Helga; it was a secret from his wife.
Exactly.
Very fascinating.
And it was very controversial. And of course, I was a young man, and responding to nude paintings had a different effect than it does now as an older man. So when I came upon the book a couple of years ago, I decided I want to write as an older man about what these paintings, what they trigger in me.
Had you already written poems based on them as a younger man?
No.
That's a shame. That would have been a really fascinating comparison.
It would have been.
I'm going to build it. I should have, but I didn't.
Yeah.
Build you a time machine and send you back.
Yeah. But that started a process, and I went for 6 months. And in 6 months, I wrote 120 poems based on different. When I finished the Helga poems, then I went to to N.C. Wyeth, who was Andrew's father, who did all the illustrations back at the turn of the 20th century. He did Treasure Island and Ivanhoe. He did all of these elegant illustrations. So I did poems based on those illustrations.
On N.C. Wyeth's
yes.
also.
And when I finished that, I went to cave paintings from Lascaux. So I moved, and when I finished that, I went to the paintings of the American Sublime. So my style is consistent throughout, and it triggered both memories. It triggered soul thoughts, philosophy, religion.
And I think that's fascinating, because I think all art is coming from that same place. And so that's...
Yep.
I really like it when artists draw off of each other like that. Let me see. Let's get back to Robert Bly. How did you meet him in the first place?
In 1983, I was in graduate school and I was studying feminist poetry at that time. And I was the only man in Michael Dennis Brown's class at the University of Minnesota, and with about 20 women. And Michael and I had just published a book called Men Don't Dance in America, which was a local success. We sold about 1,500 copies of the broadside. And Michael Dennis Brown suggested that I go see Robert Bly. And I had met Robert Bly in a seminar a couple times in Michael's seminars. And so I went to see Robert, and he was starting the Minnesota Men's Conference at the time.
And what year was this?
This would have then been February of 1984.
Okay.
Almost, today is the 17th. I believe it was the 16th February 1984.
Okay, so we're kind of hitting an anniversary here.
Right. And it was the first time I had heard poetry by a man that excited me. And because he had been raised as a farmer, because of his poetic ferocity, and because of the depth of his work, it's like, no, this is what I want. This is what I want to do. And so I went to a conference, and I've never stopped. And I ended it, I'm still participating with men where we tell stories, read poems, do a lot of deep psychological work.
He is known as a groundbreaking poet, and you've kind of touched on that, but go a little more into depth. I think especially for people who are not into poetry, they're going to say a poem's a poem. It's talking about an image or a feeling or, a rhyme scheme. What can be so groundbreaking about poetry, about Robert Bly?
Well, Robert Bly and James Wright and a number of the poets that he was associated with back in the late 50s, early 60s, they said that poetry should be in language that is used every day. And that meant that you had to break away from meter. You had to break away from rhyme schemes, and you had to polish and refine everyday speech, so that your poetry felt like it was everyday speech, but it would carry you deeper into the psyche. So
what years was Robert Bly starting his writing?
Oh, he started...
He was born, 1926?
1926, December 1926. He was writing poetry in Harvard in the 40s.
So was he sort of the beginning of the free form poetry?
It had been floating around.
Yeah, I would think it started a bit before that.
Yeah, but he also wanted to carry it. He was coming away from Harvard, where Randall Jarrell and what's his name, McLeish, James Tate, those poets were firmly established, and the young men coming back from World War II. And Robert was one of those young men.
He was in the Army?
He was in the Navy. Yeah, he was a radar operator. So they said, this is too old-fashioned. We have to break away. We have to do our own thing, And so that began. And by the time he established the 50s magazine, which was in 1957, 58, he was a brash young poet, and he more or less is saying we have to go a completely different way, and this old poetry just has to stop. Mm-hmm. We have to talk we have to write as if people understand what we're saying.
So I'm curious then, when you say that he was one of the first men whose poetry really excited you, were there others of his generation that you read that just didn't inspire you, or were you reading older poets like Yeats and Keats?
Yeah, I was reading the older poets, and John Berryman didn't do anything for me. Mm-hmm. The darkness, the confessional poets, and I was a latecomer to poetry anyway. Mm-hmm. I had been writing myself, but I hadn't been reading enough poetry. Mm-hmm. So I wasn't aware of the current crop of poets at that time. I love Wendell Berry's poetry, but it didn't fire me up. Mm-hmm. Whereas Robert fired me up.
And you have certainly inspired me to start reading his poetry. I'm looking forward to that. We are ready for beer number 3. It's poured and in the glass.
It is poured and in the glass.
What is in our glasses?
So, for this poem, I'm not sure my impression of it is absolutely correct, but, it's what the poem made me kind of imagine.
Yeah.
A campfire situation. Lots of friends around a campfire reading poems, playing music, maybe on a beach, maybe at a cabin in the North Woods. Could be anywhere, really.
Right.
But the fire, the friends is what's important.
Yeah.
And in that circumstance, you want a beer that's going to kind of fuel the joy that this poem talks about, but isn't going to be something you have to pay attention to. It's just a part of what's going on. It's the fuel for what's going on. And so you want something simple, and yet that has alcohol. And it's flavorful. It's got to have some flavor, too. So I went with an American Blonde Ale. It's simple. It's straightforward. Nothing complex about it. Doesn't get in the way. But, it also isn't bland and completely lifeless. So I chose Fulton Lonely Blonde, also Minnesota, Minneapolis brewery, because it's kind of a quintessential American blonde ale. So, cheers.
Cheers.
Like I said, straightforward, simple.
Yeah.
Doesn't get in the way. A little bit malty. Very slight hops. Delicious.
I wouldn't go so far as delicious, but I don't hate it.
All right.
Actually, I kind of like it. For those, 4.9 million listeners who don't know, I'm not much of a beer drinker. Yeah. Irony of my life after irony. This is Joy Soup.
Joy Soup.
By Tim Young.
Yeah. This is one of my favorite... This is one of my favorite compositions, and let me say ahead of time, as I wrote this is Robert. And when I read about when I say Robert in this poem, we're talking about Robert Bly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I thought so.
And this is the friends that we have. We were sitting together singing, and this is one of those nights. Joy Soup. There are nights when a veil drops, and I see that we are swimming in a vast tureen of joy soup. Our mumbled songs, our hoarse shouts, our gurgling, rambling chants simmer over Glenn's crackling, flaming guitar. Our words are fruit grease, wiggling to the surface. Robert's poems are honeydews floating in the air. With a cherry in his voice, David sings to a goddess who smacks her lips at the aroma of our cooking souls. Light a match. My poems are just kindling for the stove. Let my words be incense thrown on the charcoal. Let me be a sugar cube dropped into the tea.
Beautiful. I love that last image of being a sugar cube. And I think that's part of what I'm saying about beauty and happiness and the poetry is sometimes we need to put something positive and joyful into the world and be that sugar cube. I like that. I love that image.
It's the mysticism that I picked up reading Rumi and Ibn Arabi and so many of the Sufi mystics.
So now I need to go read Rumi too. Which brings us to a point I'm going to get to.
Yes.
Right. And part of what I really liked reading this, I think one of our very first guests ever back at 9:50 a.m. was our first guest, Michael Dean, who wrote Seashells. The book was Seashells, a book of poetry. And so once a year in late September, Michael has his big poetry party, and we go out in the evening. He lives on 5 acres by Martin Lake, and, we have a campfire, and he's got a little art shed where we do stand-up poetry, or I'll play my saxophone, and Mike will sing, and, and we just have a blast, and we trade stories and talk about why we're in poetry and so on. And so reading this really reminded me of that. And it made me think, too, a friend of mine, in fact, I believe it was Oscar Shaheen, who just keeps popping up in these last couple things. He had mentioned on Facebook, we're living in a world where we're all just too busy to get together with friends. And do you think that this is a world that's lost? Like, when is the last time you got together with these men and had a night like this?
Regularly we get together.
So you're able to still do it.
We've continued.
Fantastic.
Yes. Yeah. And to your point, my wife and I, 15 years ago, decided that we were going to do something specific. And so we started what we call our house concerts. And so once a month we have a poet or a musician or something, and we invite people over. And so as we got older, we didn't want to go out on a Saturday night into some place and fight the crowds and listen to good music. We decided to invite them to our house, and we're continuing to do that. In January, I had Michael Moose is a local poet.
Yeah, I know his name.
Yeah,
I'm not sure. I may have met him.
Yeah,
in some of the
Michael and I read at our house in a similar way. We sat down and we started trading poems back and forth. And I started. Are you familiar with Thomas R. Smith?
Thomas R. Smith was the featured poet in my anthology last year, and in fact, I think he sent you to me.
Yes.
Wow. Yeah,
Thomas
I know
is
Thomas R. Smith.
Thomas
and
I
with
go
Robert
back.
Bly too.
Exactly. Yeah. Thomas and I go way back, and Thomas and I started this where we call it a scrum, where I will read a poem, and something in that poem will trigger something in his mind. He'll go get a poem from his book, and we go back and forth, back and forth.
I know one of the open mics that I went to, I'm trying to remember if it was David Bayless. Have you been to his open mics? He does the one at Troubadour, not Poets and Pints, Poetry Happy Hour at the Troubadour on Sundays. He might be the one, or it might be Tony Plocido, who's going to be on next month. In fact, I think it was Tony from Poets and Pints who said one month, bring all the poems you have because we're doing that. Yeah,
and it's so energizing, so much fun, and it gets back to the responding to other art.
As you're talking, I'm thinking about one of my favorite books in the world, and I'm biased because I published it, but I published it because it was one of my favorite books in the world. And it's called The Feats They Run by Dan Blum. And it's this old man trapped on a desert island, and every other chapter he recounts his life moving forward from the age of 13 in pre-Nazi Germany, or, the Nazis were in power, but pre-World War II. And after the war, he's describing a scene. He's just telling about the total devastation in Germany. This man had been a German, and he had, more or less been pressured into joining the Wehrmacht and so on. But he's talking about how he sets up business after the war as an instrument repairman, and nobody comes, and finally one day an old man brings an oboe, and he has this beautiful phrase that I wish I had at the tip of my tongue about how that's when he knows that we're starting to live again. We're no longer just surviving. Once we start putting this beauty in our lives.
Yes.
So this is why it's so important. So let me go back to, this is what I wanted to ask. How in the world did your poems end up in Jazz at Lincoln Center? That's phenomenal.
I have a nephew who's a jazz composer.
Okay.
And he was at St. Olaf, and he wrote a score for Big Band based on one of my...
Define Biv Band.
Big Band.
Oh, Big Band.
I'm sorry.
Define hearing problem. No. Thank you. No, I've been played in a big band. Okay, go ahead.
So, my first book was called Building in Deeper Water. And he wrote a composition having built in deeper water based upon my book, and it won a number of awards for young jazz composers. And Jazz at Lincoln Center is both the place and it is the environment. He won an award because of that composition, having built in deeper water. And they commissioned him, because as the winner, to compose another piece for big band, and he picked Joy Soup.
Oh, wow. So which one was featured in Jazz at Lincoln Center? Both?
Both, yeah.
Wow.
So
did you go here?
So I went. This was 2006. I went in 2006 to hear the big band at Jazz at Lincoln Center, and it was quite the thrill.
Was it either of Marsalis's playing in it?
No. Although I will have to tell you, I have read poetry and sang in New Orleans, where Delfeo Marsalis opened for my group of singers.
Oh my goodness! Oh, I'm sitting in the presence of royalty.
We were at 24-hour. A 24-hour round the clock.
Okay.
It's called Bach Around the Clock.
Okay.
And it's 24 hours of music and poetry. And Delfeo was slotted the hour before me.
Okay, so
and my friends. That's why I like to say Delfeo and Marsalis for us.
That's fantastic. I have a funny story about Lincoln Center. My older daughter went to school at St. John's University in New York, and her dorm was in Lower Manhattan. So she and her friends, having a sense of humor, like to kind of pull some, trolling on the people of New York. So one day, they had their friend put up an umbrella and had their big beefy male friend walk in front of her, kind of doing this, stand back, people stand back. And and all of a sudden, mass psychology, people started going, oh, who is it? Oh my gosh, I think I know her. Oh, get a picture. And people started trying to get a picture of her, just assuming she must...
Yeah, right. Must be somebody.
Must be someone important. So one of their other trolls they pulled was they went to Lincoln Center. And their friend was supposed to be filming it, and her friend David got down on his knees and started opening this little box, and all of a sudden everybody started gathering around. Oh my gosh, there's a proposal happening, and people got really excited. And my daughter went, I can't marry you. And they wanted to see the reaction of people, and unfortunately their friend didn't. They pushed the button the wrong way and ended up stopping the film just as it should have started. So, but that's what I think of when I think of Lincoln Center now. They staged that on the stairs there. So we're coming down to our last minutes. But I want to ask you, you have been so influenced by Robert Bly, obviously devoted thousands upon thousands of hours of poetry. What do you hope people will take from your poetry?
Poetry can be a way of life. If you have curiosity and intention, and you're willing to share it, life is full, and life is exciting, and life is painful, and life is rich, and that's what poetry is. That's what life is, and they're connected in that way. You don't have to be a poet per se. That's one reason why I often don't say I'm a poet. because I'm a man that's trying to live life as fully as possible.
And you just gave me the perfect segue into a question that I'm trying to ask more and more often in the various interviews I do, not only here, but with the authors at Gabriel's Horn who I do interviews with. What do you think is the most important thing to live life well?
It's not. There is not one thing.
Not one thing?
It's a combination of curiosity and courage.
Mm-hmm. What has motivated you the most in life? Would you say curiosity?
No.
No?
No, it's the relationships that I've created. My awareness of relationship. And that awareness that I have a relationship with my family, my son, my wife. I have my brothers and sisters. I have a relationship with the trees, the garden. I have relationships. It's the awareness of the relationships that is most important to me. And
I think a lot of that speaks to what you were saying, Joy Sue. That's all about the importance of relationships. So we are down to the end here, unfortunately, because there are 1,000 more questions I'd love to ask. Michael, where can people find you online?
I am at aperfectpint.net and aperfectpint on all the other socials. Except Twitter. I canceled my Twitter account. Oh,
no. Why'd you do that?
I never use it.
Oh, yeah. Mine is connected to Facebook. I go there sometimes. I'm at Facebook, Laura.Vosica.author. It has been a long month. I had to think. Laura Vosica at Twitter. BluebellsChronicles.com is my website, although I think LauraVosica.com will also point you to my book's website. And we're at?
We're at Book and Brews on Instagram, and good Lord, Books and Brews with Laura Vosica and Michael Agnew on Facebook, something like that.
And yeah, it's exactly like that. And we also have a YouTube channel. So
I don't know what that is.
Yeah, it's a string of letters. We're not eligible for a custom name, and I'm highly incensed, but whatever, they don't really care. Tim, where can they find you?
My Facebook is Timothy Young, and I'm also I have a Facebook page, To the Palace of Kings, and then I have a YouTube channel, which is Timtwoboots, all lowercase together.
To the word two, TWO?
Yep.
Number 2.
Yep.
I'm sorry, not the number 2, the word
right.
2,
the
which
word
is
two.
The number 2, not also. Yes.
TIMTWOBOOTS.
Okay. And do you have any upcoming events that you would like people to know about?
I do. I'm performing with friends our 10th annual Blues Night, March 6th and 7th with the Holy Hollers, and that's part of our house concert series.
Oh, very fun. Is that open to the public?
It is, but reservations are needed, and you'll have to go to my website.
Okay, and your website
Or not my website, my Facebook. My website is gone.
Okay, so the Facebook would be
yes.
To the Palace of Kings.
Yeah.
Okay, so they know where to get that.
Yeah.
Michael, have we changed
no
the
public
trend?
Events. No public events. I have a couple private events coming up, but people can't come to those.
No gate crashes allowed. My only events, really, I still have Scotland in the Eyes of the Author coming up in Maplewood and Prior Lake, but that's a long way off. And the Gabriel's Horn Anthology is taking submissions. This year's theme is nature. And you can find that information at gabrielshornpress.com/poetry-anthology, or just look under news and events at gabrielshornpress.com. And coming up next month, we have Tony Plocido. He is a poet, sometime photographer, and the author of 3 books of poetry, along with work published in 4 anthologies, including mine, not to make a shameless plug here. He hosts 3 open mic series, Writers Read, Main Street Open Mic in Hopkins, and Poets and Pints at Sisyphus Brewery in Minneapolis. And he's also active in Cracked Walnut, which you're probably familiar with.
No.
You're not?
No,
not at all. I'll tell you about that.
Yes.
All right. That wraps up episode number 11.
Yeah, thank you, Tim, for
Thank
coming
you.
to join us. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been episode 11 of Books and Brews. Thanks.